Hello and welcome to this CIO webcast, brought to you in association with CyberArk. I'm Stephen Pritchard and I'm a contributing editor at CIO.com. And today we're going to be talking about the changing relationship between cloud and security. So I'm joined today by Ivo van Bennekom from PwC and Josh Kirkwood, who is from CyberArk. So before we go into the discussion, if I could just ask both of our guests to introduce themselves. Ivo first.
Sure. Hi, I'm Ivo, partner at the cybersecurity organization of PwC and leading the Impact Center for Digital Identity across EMEA.
Thank you, Josh.
Hi, I'm Josh Kirkwood. I'm the technical lead for strategic alliances in CyberArk.
Thank you. So when we come to looking at cloud computing, let's just establish where we are, what the state of play is at the moment. Is it fair to say that it is now, absolutely a mainstream technology? And I think there's some research figures that said that 90% or more of organizations currently use the cloud in some form of another. But if we could just put some detail around that, perhaps, Ivo, what are you seeing when you're talking to your clients? What percentage of organizations are genuinely using the cloud at the moment?
So the clients that I'm working with, or the organizations that I'm in contact with, I've never seen anybody not using cloud. So that's the first and foremost thing. I think that what you look at nowadays is when you're thinking about cloud, that there's a variety of options available for organizations. So we're talking about SaaS applications, we're talking about PaaS applications, we're talking about iOS infrastructure as a service. And what I find interesting is that while it is typically always in use in some form or another, that not everybody is always aware that they're actually using SaaS. And that is, I think, one of the bigger challenges that also the security folks have to face, making this work. What I find personally interesting, I've been in this cloud journey for over 10 years. And in 2017, I was thinking, well, we've done all this cloud stuff. And then I went to a CIO summit, and there were 200 CIOs talking about how to manage and bring all that critical data to the cloud. And I was thinking, hey, I thought that we've done already this, but what you now see is a big shift moving actually from sort of, the edge computing use cases for organizations to really making their business critical systems available in the cloud, which drives an enormous change in business behavior and also in the security posture that is coming across that.
And we've certainly seen a big push towards that over the last 18 months or so. But Josh, when you talk to your customer base, what are they saying they're using the cloud for at the moment? And how do you see that's changing?
So I'll add to Ivo's thing straight away in saying that I view that cloud's no longer like the destination. It's absolutely there. Everybody's present. They're not entirely sure where they are because it may be a mix of SaaS, it may be IaaS and PaaS. But we're always in this sort of continuous moving forwards in terms of we moved infrastructure to the cloud, we moved from infrastructure in the cloud to platform, we started adopting SaaS services, we've transitioned our responsibilities away from where it is. And even in organizations or countries where the attitude towards storing your data in somebody else's environment is probably less welcome, still running straight into it because it seems to be a requirement for modern business.
Absolutely. So from a security point of view, and of course, that's why we're here today, what is that causing people to think about, and what sort of changes is that presenting, and particularly, what challenges is it presenting? And particularly if we compare maybe the cloud a few years ago, and I know it's dangerous to try to pick a point in time with anything like this, but if we go back to, a lot of businesses say we will use this cloud provider and therefore we'll integrate our security with theirs, or hopefully they're asking that question. But now they're moving towards multiple providers and using different cloud infrastructure. They're using software as a service, as we've already mentioned, for different purposes. And just to throw another thing in the mix for you both, the fact that parts of the business potentially are buying cloud technology directly rather than going through the IT department, let alone the office of the CISO. What would your take be, Josh, just initially on that? And is that a big problem? Is it a problem that people are aware of?
So look, I hate the framing of it being a problem. And admittedly, I'm a vendor in this space. So of course I have to tell you it's a problem. But let's be realistic here. It's a massive challenge. Migration is actually a really uncomfortable word for a lot of people's cloud journeys because a migration implies that you sort of start and finish it, whereas journey is probably way more fitting because you're continuously moving forwards. And the first part of the security challenge is that your security has basically doubled. You now have 2 estates to secure. You're not in a transitional period where you can get away with securing one. We've definitely seen if you're picking a point of time in the past and move from security being an effort to placate an audit to now being genuinely there to secure the business. Ransomware happens every day. Breaches happen every week, or notifiable breaches that make the news happen every week. It's more pressure. And then add to that many of the security professionals, especially because the security industry can sometimes gate joining it. It's quite hard for new talent to come in. They've got to learn. They've got to sit there and now appreciate what Azure Sentinel is instead of the SIEM they knew and loosely disliked of the past. And it's a lot of work. It means that we've now got this massive pressure to innovate as an industry, to grow our own personal knowledge and to change everything we knew while still protecting the stuff that's not migrated or a little slower on that journey. So it's a lot of challenge.
Yeah, and certainly CISOs are looking at having to maintain security on existing estates as well as what they're doing in the cloud. So that pressure is increasing. But Ivo, are we seeing any particular areas where you've identified gaps in capability or gaps in protection between cloud providers and on-premises systems?
Yeah, so there's a couple of points that I wanted to make, and I'm not going to state the obvious stuff, but one of the things that I'm seeing now is that based on the fact that people are tending to use cloud and they have sort of, their own idea what cloud is, that, for example, means that they are thinking that the cloud provider is managing the security of the infrastructure, which is true if you're using SaaS applications, but is not true if you're using PaaS or IaaS, and you still have the responsibility for it yourself. So that's, some of those common misunderstandings that we see happening. But more importantly, and I wanted to pick back to what Josh just said around sort of it's a journey. What I'm now seeing alongside you used to have 2 managed estates. One was your cloud estate, which was managed, and sometimes you're using Azure AD for that. Sometimes you use other tooling for that. And then you have your AD on-premise situation as well. And those 2 were disconnected. There was not a lot of integration between the 2. And what you're now seeing is that actually integration is becoming more and more common. And with that, also new attack pathways for malicious actors are coming in, which are not being recognized as a security potential security breach yet. Because those organizational types within companies typically are not used to speak to each other in a way, because the one is handling the on-premise stuff and the other one is handling the cloud stuff, and that integration is becoming more and more important. So you have to really look at, with cloud, you also have to look at who's managing the infrastructure, what are the responsibilities from cybersecurity, who's managing the access to data, who's managing the access to the business applications. And from that perspective, you have to do exactly the same thing as on-premise. But there are varieties that you need to consider in terms of your risk framework.
I'll jump in here quickly because you've hit something that I think we all leave behind a little bit, and the concept of perimeter and responsibility and what's your problem and what's theirs is something that's changed a lot. I remember my 10 years ago, I worked as an architect in an infrastructure provider. The perimeter was the physical security of the building. Now, what building, whose buildings, where are they, which regions, which countries, where's the data, who cares? The only thing protecting this is identity. You've already alluded to that. In some organizations, there's 2 different repositories of identity now because the cloud has its own and the enterprise has its own on-prem. And I think we're going to spend some time on it later, but there are organizations where there's a 3rd repository of identity because there's nothing stopping you from taking your credit card out and speeding up the organization's digital transformation by swiping you through, expensing it, receiving some air miles, and really innovating as quickly as possible. So it does mean this massive change.
So are we seeing then people actively looking, so bad actors actively looking for gaps between the security layers that we have? So whether that's between on-premises security and cloud security, or between cloud providers and the different formats of cloud?
Oh, gosh, yes. Look, again, vendor hat on. Our labs did some fantastic research about Golden SAML as a way of persisting in an attack. But if you look at the whole drama that started this year off around monitoring vendor having supply chain issues, and that being used to effectively allow an attacker into customers' environments. Golden SAML methodology was how they persisted access rights in the cloud, and that only exists because the cloud vendors had to create a shim to allow you to bring identity into their platform from your own. These gaps are exactly where an attacker's looking, and it's easier to scan for them because it's internet facing. It's easier to programmatically exploit them because, again, internet facing, known, and it reduces the complexity required for an attacker, right? I'm a little tired of the nation state attacker mindset. And yes, there are people in bunkers crafting cyber pathogens, looking for 0 days, building a repository of these weapons they'll deploy as part of the Tom Clancy novel that seems to be read in a lot of these discussions. But there are also individuals that are able to do it because, quite frankly, we're talking about exploiting systems that exist and are just misconfigured rather than finding 0 days here. So it means the breaches have become both more complex and simpler. Big changes, eh?
So, Ivo, would you then agree that actually some of the problems that we're seeing when it comes to deploying cloud securely is that people are not following those basic rules of cyber hygiene?
Well, I think that's part of the problem. I also think that we need to revisit what cyber hygiene looks like and also how we are managing that, because like Josh just said, it's not only nation-state attackers, but it really varies from nation-state attackers to third-party misusing data because they're in your cloud systems, to malicious insiders that are misusing data deliberately or by accident. That is a separate conversation in itself. But it comes down to understanding sort of how do you need to diversify. And it used to be very simple because either you were in the premise or you were not. And based on that, you were allowed access or you were not. But with cloud systems, it's not in your parameter anymore. So that means that you also need to rethink what are the types of identities that you're actually managing. And within a lot of companies, we are actually seeing that third-party identities are managed in exactly the same way and are being controlled in exactly the same way as your own employees. While that is not a realistic scenario in cloud systems, because typically third-party access is more subject to change than it was. And secondly, I think that a lot of organizations are also relying on third-party IT providers to help them to configure their cloud systems, either SaaS or PaaS or IaaS. And with that, the credentials that they have are typically highly privileged, and sometimes you're then relying on a identity lifecycle or credential lifecycle of a third party. So you also need to understand how that is changing. So one of the things that I think that you always need to start with is rethinking and reconsidering your security framework and how you're actually, putting the right measures on top of the right types of identities that you need to manage, and also make a separation between the fact that you need to manage credentials and that you need to manage identities, and they both have their own life cycle that you need to understand how to protect that in an appropriate way.
That's a very, very good point, and maybe that's not always considered fully. I think, Josh, you have some key points that we categorize as risky behaviors around this, though, so perhaps we could run through those, and then we can look at what their likely impact is, and particularly how CISOs can tackle some of them. So you've mentioned things like shadow administration, over-permissioning, and so forth, software supply chains, which we've also already talked about. But I just want to run through some of the risky behaviors that you see.
So the list starts with like the now mundane, the hard-coded credentials type story. This haunted the news of many cloud innovators in the past because it's such an easy mistake to make. And do you know what? It's a relatable mistake to make. It's the same as not liking MFA, but knowing you need it. Because a lot of people hate, I have to get my phone out. But when I built my first applications as part of trying to get my head around this brand new Windows Azure at the time, fantastic. Passwords went into the code because where do you put them? What do you do with that? It's a token, who cares? But the hygiene, that hygiene challenge is definitely there and present across the entire estate. And then you've got the fact that consistent management of the hygiene across this entire estate. To talk to Ivo's point, we may not entirely be comfortable with what best practice is at the moment as an organization. as an enterprise organization, enforcing that consistently across many different cloud environments is going to be super painful. Dealing with the provisioning of identity in this space, especially if somebody swiped their credit card to accelerate the old cloud transformation, it's probably not going to be tied into systems that are making sure that it is done consistently. So it's going to get really painful. And then that sort of ends up being the risky behaviors that underpin every other individual. And I won't go into specifics. I know we talk about things like shadow admins, but all of that exists because there is seldom a single point of control, a single point of oversight, or somebody writing a developer-first cloud security policy. I think that's what Ivo was aligning to.
I think if viewers want to drill down into this, there'll be some resources available as well on the webcast that you can download. But in terms of countermeasures, then, Ivo, what should the CISO be doing to head off some of these problems and to mitigate?
So that's always an interesting discussion, right? So where do you start? And I already said, okay, start by revisiting your controls framework and see if that's still adequate for the new reality that you're in with cloud and on-premise infrastructure. I think that it boils down to basic behavior, right? So we're always talking about awareness and the business needing to take responsibility for sort of who has access to what. I also think that it's partly the IT and the CISO's responsibility to actually create a framework that the business is also capable to understand, and providing monitoring measures to sort of help the business to understand what the appropriate access should look like based on that framework. So not a technical framework, but really a business-enabled framework, so that the business understands, listen, we have certain credentials that have really high privileges. How can we limit those as much as possible and only use them as needed? And then secondly, after you've done that and you are continuously monitoring whether or not that is being adequately used, you can also start thinking about automating those type of things. And so it is, for me, a large switch from trying to prevent all kinds of attack paths or abuse paths towards also more monitoring, because the complexity is so much that you cannot already figure out at the start what all the possible options will be to misuse cloud infrastructure. So you need to start monitoring more. I think that is an important one. Create that infrastructure and then making sure that you combine IAM with your PAM strategy to make sure that you're actually using that in an appropriate way, so that you can manage the lifecycle of the identities and the credentials in an appropriate way. So start with thinking what you need to do and how you can support the business, so that you can also take the business along with the journey that you need to make it secure.
And Josh, is this something that requires sort of ongoing work, because it's not something that's a point-in-time solution? Cloud deployments evolve, the use of technology in the business evolves. So does that mean that the identity and access management side needs to evolve too as we go forward?
Yeah, this is something that you can't just sit down in a committee, write a policy and call it a day. It's something that is going to have to grow with your business and the attitudes you have. And I'm going to call out a behavior I saw from Ivo that I absolutely love. He didn't mention vendors. He didn't call out a specific cloud vendor. He didn't call out a given technology platform. He didn't say Kubernetes or blockchain. So, refreshing these days. And he's doing that because he's going to write policy that is relevant for whatever the business comes with. So the CISO is able to sort of deal with the disconnect from all the direct innovation that may be happening from the credit card guys in the field, but they're able to write policy that's appropriate to support this. And that for me is really key.
Yeah, and to that point, Josh, just so one of the things that I consistently see popping up more and more as well is, so first and foremost, let's not forget that IT is the business nowadays in a lot of scenarios, right? We used to build manufacturing plants, now we're building completely digital business models. So also the business is changing and understanding better what they need to do, but the business typically is looking at one specific cloud vendor to support them, and those typically also have some security measures that you can configure and use. But as those multi-cloud infrastructures are getting more and more connected, and those applications are getting more and more connected to make sure that the business keeps running across all those platforms, I see a new tendency, and that is that you also need to start looking at SOD violations, for example, in a variety of cloud systems, and also especially the violations in multi-cloud systems. I've been in a lot of conversations where the guys from a certain cloud platform say, "Hey, listen, we got this whole credentials thing covered because it's in our system, and the cloud provider is providing us that," but they're then misunderstanding the fact that that risky behavior not only comes from what is happening in their infrastructure, but could actually come from the combination of two infrastructure accesses that they are not managing. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges in terms of complexity that we need to start understanding better and also start managing better as organizations.
What other barriers are there to establishing best practice here, though?
I think Ivo just called out one of them. One I think the biggest challenge is you end up with very tribal alliances to vendors and technologies rather than to the goals of the business. That can end up making it challenging to write best practice. The gaps that exist tie back to an earlier point you made about gaps between services being how an attacker enters. And sorry, I'll pass it on back to you, Ivo, because I think you see an awful lot of this.
Yeah, so I already mentioned a couple, and Josh, I think to your point, that's absolutely correct. One of the things, and no offense to the people that are working for vendors here, but one of the biggest challenges as cybersecurity folks that we have is that you are being trained as a cybersecurity professional in the vendor that you're working with. You're not being trained on sort of holistically thinking about things, but you're thinking about things in a certain vendor fashion. So I think that is one of the biggest challenges that we have, that we need to mature ourselves, that we understand the concepts, and then think about how we can implement those concepts in the right tooling. And secondly, I think that with the complexity that I already mentioned earlier, it is becoming increasingly difficult to understand what you need to do. And on top of that, there is a huge skill shortage that we have within organizations. And then, so I said something around vendors that wasn't maybe so pleasant. But on the other hand, I also see that a lot of vendors are actually using AI and technology and also the cloud computing to actually help organizations to not spend millions of hours anymore on the technical implementation, but automating that more and more, also thinking about low code platforms to actually help the business to be better prepared for those challenges that they come across, so that you can focus on the business and not on the IT engineering in itself. So I see so partly challenges, partly also people trying to fix that. And I think that is a nice balance, because the complexity increases, and if then vendors are not stepping up to help automate more and more, the problem would just grow. And I see that there's at least, because of that, we see that you might be able to keep up with the pace of the change in complexity.
But it's important also, though, that we don't lose sight of the fact that the cloud is this huge enabling technology, and it's bringing massive efficiencies and flexibility to the business.
Yes.
So if I could just ask us to wrap up a little. I know it's difficult to summarize all we've discussed right now, but this idea that cloud and security is really a model of shared responsibility, perhaps if you could both just give me your thoughts on that to summarize.
I'll go for this. Look, I love the shared responsibility model. I like it when things are clear. I think it's one of the big cultural changes that has improved the state of security. But at the same time, I park my car in a station car park whenever I go to the airport or to the offices in London, and there is a little sign, and it's the shared responsibility model between the car park and me, and it says, all vehicles left at owner's responsibility. All the car park's done is done something not dissimilar to what the cloud vendors are doing. They've said, we're doing the car park security. We are committed to delivering car park services. If the building burns down, that's a problem because we can't do car parking. Your car, that's on you. And if you wanted us to look after your car's security, different price point. It's not £25 a day, southeast of England. It's £350 a day, because we're going to have to put security guards on that. It's going to be a very different challenge. So look, vendors will tell you what you need to worry about. It's up to you to have the culture that allows you to translate that into business requirements and have the leadership that's able to define strategies that allow you to do that. Ivo?
Yeah, I think that is a great analogy. And just to add to that, I see also a lot of organizations that are actually having another organization to park your car in that parking lot. So that increases the complexity, I think, a little bit as well, because you're basically just handing over your car for somebody else to park it there. And you need to manage that shared responsibility between a variety of actors within your organization. Wrapping this up, I think that for me, the most important thing is that we stop thinking about security as an IT problem. I think that we need to start thinking about it. How do you actually make sure that you create a risk framework that the business can understand, so that they can work alongside with you to understand if that risk is actually a risk or not. And then from there, start thinking about automating and doing the technology, because you will be if you think in advance on how you want to set up the capability, it will be so much easier to implement the technology to automate that capability. And I think that is the most important thing to start thinking about. It's not IT infrastructure anymore; it is your business. So behave like that.
So thank you very much. So Ivo van Bennekom from PwC and Josh Kirkwood from CyberArk, thank you very much for your time today. There's more information about this, of course, on CIO.com and on CyberArk.com. And so thank you very much for watching.